The city never collapses with noise. It collapses with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes before impact. You feel it before you understand it. A shift in the air, a pause in the rhythm, a crack in the pattern you've lived inside for years. Most people ignore it. They wait for confirmation, for someone on a screen to tell them what they already sensed. By the time that happens, they're already trapped inside the kill box. You won't make that mistake. Not after this. You live in a world where the collapse isn't an earthquake or a storm. It's a battle over resources, territory, and control. And civilians are always the last to know they've become the target. You don't wait for chaos. You detect its first shadow. You read indicators the same way a sniper reads wind. You watch what others overlook. You respond when others rationalize. Survival isn't strength, it's timing. There are 7 indicators: subtle, silent, lethal. They appear before the streets burn, before the stores empty, before the news pretends to understand what's happening. These signals are the early tremors of a city entering its death cycle. When one of them shifts, you prepare. When 2 align, you move. When 3 hit at once, you evacuate without hesitation. No speeches, no warnings, no second guessing. This is your blueprint for staying ahead of the fall, your framework for reading the unseen battlefield you live in every day. Your edge against the forces that want you blind, immobile, and dependent. From this moment forward, you treat every indicator as truth. You treat hesitation as a threat. And you treat your exit plan as the only line between you and the aftermath. You're here to learn the signals that tell you one thing with absolute clarity. It's time to leave the city before the city consumes you. You've been taught to watch what's visible. That's why most people fail. The city doesn't break when the lights go out or when the crowds riot. Those are surface fractures, loud, obvious, irrelevant to anyone operating at a tactical level. The real collapse begins in the systems civilians never see. The invisible infrastructure. The quiet machinery that keeps a metropolis fed, supplied, and stabilized. When it stutters, even for a moment, the countdown begins. You track the pulse of logistics, the way a medic tracks a dying patient. Delivery routes lengthen. Warehouse activity drops at night. Trucks bypass their usual paths. Rail lines shift to irregular schedules. Vendors limit inventory without explanation. These are not coincidences. They are deliberate adjustments made by people who know something the public doesn't. When supply chains reroute, it means someone with authority is bracing for turbulence. You don't need the details. You just need the signal. Financial signals follow the same pattern. Not the stock market, that's theater. You observe the real-world markers, ATM replenishment times stretching longer than usual, payment systems flickering at off-peak hours, subtle restrictions on daily cash withdrawals. Banks don't telegraph instability. They mask it behind maintenance messages. But you recognize the truth. When money slows, movement slows. When movement slows, survival slows. And when survival slows, cities fall. Even utilities have tells. A sudden, unexplained drop in water pressure. A rolling outage in a district that never experiences them. A short-lived blackout that officials dismiss as routine. These are stress tests, or warnings, depending on who's pulling the strings. Infrastructure teams know days or weeks before the public. Their adjustments are predictive, not reactive. When they start shifting patterns, you should already be evaluating your exit route. You watch for the invisible because the visible arrives too late. When the unseen components of the city begin to misfire, you don't rationalize. You don't debate. You don't wait for validation from a headline. You register the disturbance and you tighten your perimeter. This is the first indicator for a reason. It gives you time, the rarest survival asset in an urban collapse. A city that stumbles in silence is a city preparing to break. And when the hidden systems start whispering their warnings, you don't ignore them. You listen. You interpret. You prepare to move before everyone else realizes the ground beneath them has already shifted. A city is a living organism. It breathes through its people, it pulses through its routines, and it reveals its sickness long before it collapses. You read these changes like battlefield cues. Civilians dismiss them as stress, bad days, or coincidence. But you know better. When the behavior patterns of a city shift, the psychology of the population is already breaking. And psychology breaks before infrastructure, before security, before anything visible. This is the second indicator, the human tremor before the structural quake. You sense it first in the eyes. People stop making micro-connections. They avoid gaze, avoid conversation, avoid acknowledgement. Their movements become sharper, less fluid, more guarded. A city that once flowed begins to move like prey. Fear has entered the bloodstream, not the loud kind, the quiet, buried kind that spreads faster and kills sooner. Then you observe the rhythm. Streets that used to hum with predictable energy feel off-tempo. Commutes become erratic. Crowds thin at hours that should be dense. Businesses open later, close earlier. Public spaces feel colder, heavier, like the air is holding its breath. When the rhythm breaks, the social contract is cracking. Next comes the change in conflict patterns. Arguments escalate faster. Drivers become hostile. Small confrontations turn sharp, immediate, uncontrolled. People who were once indifferent now hover on the edge of violence. Containment is failing from the inside. This is the mind of a population sensing threat without understanding it. Instinct moves before logic, and instinct is rarely wrong. You also track the migration signals, subtle but decisive. Longtime residents quietly packing, families leaving at odd hours, rental trucks in neighborhoods that don't usually see them. Not a mass exodus, just sporadic disappearances. Those who leave first are not impulsive, they are informed. And finally, the tone of the crowd shifts. A collective unease settles. Conversations shorten, smiles diminish. There's a stiffness in the way people hold their bodies, a tension in the way they occupy space. The city feels like an animal that has sensed a predator but cannot identify its direction. Fear without clarity is the most dangerous form. When behavior changes at scale, it is never spontaneous. It is never accidental. It is never random. It is a reaction to forces moving beneath the surface, forces that civilians can't articulate but can feel in their bones. You don't wait for the explanation. You don't wait for the breaking point. The city's psychological armor is failing, and when the mind breaks, the body follows. You read the shift in behavior the way you read shifting wind before a long-range shot. A small deviation tells you everything about what will happen next, and when the city starts adjusting its movements like a creature preparing for impact, you treat it as the warning it is. Because the population always senses the collapse before the collapse shows itself. Scarcity is never accidental. Not in a modern city, not in a system engineered to keep shelves stocked and citizens calm. When essential resources begin to disappear, it's not random, it's strategic. Someone, somewhere, has decided to pull back, to conserve, to redirect. And when the resources shift, the city follows. This is the third indicator, And it's one of the most dangerous because civilians misinterpret it every time. They call it shortage. They blame panic buying, supply delays, shipping issues, seasonal fluctuations. That's noise. What you're looking for is the pattern, the cycle of absence. When fuel availability becomes inconsistent across districts, when pharmacies show gaps in medication for several days at a time, when bottled water stocks fluctuate in ways that feel unnatural, these are not retail anomalies. They are pressure points, and pressure points always reveal where stress is building in the system. You watch fuel first. Diesel is the lifeblood of logistics. When diesel becomes scarce, even slightly, the city's circulatory system clogs. Emergency services slow. Deliveries reroute. Supply prioritization shifts. Diesel scarcity is the whisper before the shout. If you see stations quietly limiting quantities, adjusting hours, or shutting pumps for maintenance, you know the grid is under strain. Then you track pharmaceuticals. Not the specialty drugs, the basics. Antibiotics, asthma medication, insulin. When these begin vanishing in rotations, you're observing a deeper instability. Medical supply chains are among the last to fail because their failure is catastrophic. If they flicker, something upstream is already breaking. Water is next. Not the tap, the bottled reserves. People don't trust public water when tension rises. They migrate to bottled. When the city knows turbulence is coming, distribution patterns change. Warehouses hold back. Retailers ration in silence. You see the shift in the empty spaces on shelves, the oddly timed restocks, the sudden disappearance of gallons and multi-packs while premium brands remain untouched. That's not demand. That's a signal. Food scarcity is the one that civilians finally notice, but by the time food disappears, the situation is already in motion. You're watching for an earlier tell, perishable goods going first, not last. When fresh produce, dairy, meat, bread rotate irregularly or arrive in smaller batches, the city is compensating for stress they expect to worsen. And if the grocery stores cut their closing hours or reduce staff presence on the floor, you're looking at operational degradation, a precursor to panic once the public catches on. You monitor these patterns because scarcity is how the city reveals its internal conflict. When resources thin, competition rises. When competition rises, control tightens. And when control tightens, collapse is already in motion behind the scenes. Civilians won't understand the significance until it hits their kitchen. But by then, your evacuation window has narrowed to hours, not days. Resource scarcity doesn't warn you with alarms. It warns you with absences, quiet, repeating, widening absences. And when those absences shift from random to rhythmic, you don't question the cause. You don't wait for confirmation. You interpret the pattern for what it truly is, the early stage of a resource war. And once the war begins, the city stops being a place to live and becomes a place to escape. Security never fails all at once. It erodes, slowly, quietly, then suddenly. And if you're paying attention, you see the cracks long before the chaos pours through them. This is the fourth indicator, the degradation of security signals, not the crime itself, but the patterns that surround it. The signals most civilians miss because they're looking in the wrong direction. You're not a civilian. You read the city the way a tracker reads footprints in dust. The first signal is response time. Every city has a cadence. When you hear sirens less frequently during peak hours, or when you notice they're arriving late at scenes they would once have reached fast, it means capacity is stretched, or priorities have shifted. Both are warning signs. A city doesn't announce when it's overwhelmed. It simply stops showing up on time. Then you monitor what authorities stop responding to altogether. Some districts begin receiving less patrol presence. Reports of break-ins get logged, but never followed up. Non-emergency categories get widened quietly. These aren't oversights. They're triage decisions. When law enforcement begins choosing what not to respond to, they're signaling internal strain. Next, you observe the boundary lines, the street-level frontiers between order and disorder. Areas that used to be safe during the day become questionable at dusk. Areas that were questionable at dusk become voids by night. Every city has unspoken no-go zones, but when those zones expand, merge, or appear in places they've never existed, it means the balance of control is shifting away from authority and toward opportunists. And then there's the presence of organized actors, not amateurs, professionals. You recognize them by posture, by coordination, by confidence. They operate openly, unchallenged. When they appear in clusters across multiple districts at the same time, it means they know something you don't. It means the vacuum of power has begun. Civilians will rationalize their presence. You don't. You understand that organized groups don't move unless the environment favors them. You also track the signals of defensive posture. Security shutters staying closed on businesses that normally open early. Private security doubling up at locations that never required it. Apartment complexes upgrading access controls overnight. Corporations quietly reinforcing their entry points. These aren't coincidences, they're preparations. When institutions brace themselves, you should already be preparing to move. The most critical signal of all is the tone of authority. When officials speak less, not more. When their statements become vague, repetitive, or strategically calm. When they avoid specifics. When they downplay events that are clearly escalating. Silence is not reassurance. It is a tactical admission of loss. When authority stops communicating clearly, it means they're losing control of the narrative, and usually the ground with it. Security doesn't evaporate. It withdraws, it hesitates, it repositions. And when the city's protectors begin to falter, even subtly, the collapse accelerates. You don't wait for visible chaos. You act the moment security signals degrade. Because once the protective layer thins, the predators step in, and once they step in, the time for a safe evacuation closes fast. A city without strong security isn't a city anymore. It's open terrain. And open terrain is no place to stay. Information doesn't vanish without purpose. When a city enters a destabilizing phase, the first battlefield is not the street. It's the signal. The blackout of information is not a malfunction. It's a tactic. Someone is controlling what you see, what you don't, and when you see it. This is the fifth indicator, and it is one of the most decisive. When information becomes unreliable, the environment is no longer civilian terrain. It becomes contested territory. The earliest sign is the subtle thinning of updates. Agencies that used to publish hour-by-hour reports begin spacing their communication. Websites go under maintenance at critical moments. Traffic alerts stop reflecting reality. Emergency notifications appear delayed, generic, or incomplete. Civilians shrug this off. You don't. A disruption in information flow is never accidental. It is the first step in controlling movement, perception, and response. Next comes the inconsistencies. News reports contradict eyewitness accounts. Official statements conflict with each other. Small incidents are either inflated or buried. Timelines don't match. The truth isn't disappearing. It's being rearranged. A government or institution under stress doesn't reveal chaos. It conceals it by fragmenting the signal. Confusion replaces clarity, and confusion paralyzes those who still rely on traditional channels for direction. Then you pay attention to the digital environment. Sudden outages that hit specific platforms but not others. Messaging delays. Network congestion during off-peak hours. Social feeds throttled or suspiciously quiet. Not total blackouts, selective ones. They're more dangerous because they're harder to detect. Selective communication control is a precision tool. It isolates, separates, and blinds specific groups before they know they're being targeted. Watch for the choke points. Entire neighborhoods losing network access while nearby districts remain unaffected. Public Wi-Fi shutting down without notice. Data speeds dropping to a crawl in areas where unrest is rising. These aren't failures. They're containment operations. When authorities or unknown actors anticipate movement, they cut the signal to control the flow of bodies and information. And then the silence arrives. The absolute quiet. The moment when official channels fall still at the exact time they should be speaking loudly. That silence is the loudest warning you will ever receive. It means the situation is either escalating faster than they can frame it, or they don't want you to know how fast it's collapsing. A silent authority is a compromised authority. You also watch for the inverse, an overload of noise. Too many updates, too many messages, too many explanations that say nothing. Overcommunication is a camouflage tactic, designed to saturate your senses so you can't distinguish truth from distraction. In moments like this, civilians get lost. You stay cold. You watch for patterns, not headlines. For consistency, not emotion. For the gaps between messages, not the messages themselves. When information becomes a weapon, the environment is no longer safe. The collapse of communication is not the prelude to danger. It is the confirmation that danger is already present. Once the signal goes dark or distorted, you no longer wait for clarity. You assume the worst-case scenario is in motion, and you prepare to act with full autonomy. When the city's voice falters, you don't listen harder. You stop listening, and you start moving. There is a moment in every collapsing city when the civilians are no longer the primary actors. The streets shift. The atmosphere thickens. The movement patterns change. You start seeing people who don't belong. People who move with purpose, with training, with awareness. This is the sixth indicator, the tactical movements of non-civilians. And when they appear, you're no longer observing instability. You're witnessing the transition into conflict terrain. You identify them long before the average person even notices. They don't wander. They survey. They don't panic. They position. They don't react to the environment. The environment reacts to them. Their presence is deliberate, their timing precise. They appear in areas that are strategically important, not convenient. They leave no noise in their wake, only pressure. Sometimes they come in uniforms, sometimes in civilian clothing, sometimes in unmarked gear that signals everything without revealing anything. Their posture gives them away, upright but relaxed, alert without being tense, scanning without appearing to scan. They assess exits, choke points, blind corners. They move in twos or threes, never alone, never without purpose. Civilians never see these details. You do. Their vehicles tell their own story. Not the flashy ones, the nondescript models with reinforced suspensions, tinted windows, and no identifying markings. They idle in places that provide oversight. Elevated positions, long sight lines, proximity to infrastructure nodes. When those vehicles show up repeatedly at unusual hours, You're watching coordinated presence, not coincidence. Then there are the supply movements. Quiet convoys at dawn, equipment cases being unloaded behind sealed buildings, personnel appearing at rooftops that are normally inaccessible to the public, temporary barriers going up overnight with no announcement. These are not preparations for public safety. They are preparations for operational activity. Someone is positioning assets. Someone is getting ready. You also track what's missing. Patrols that once dominated certain districts suddenly vanish. Checkpoints dissolve. Regular security presence thins while unfamiliar units appear in their place. This swap is intentional. It means control is being redistributed. When control shifts, it's because the landscape is changing in ways civilians will only understand when they're already caught in it. The most critical sign is when the non-civilian actors begin shaping the flow of people without ever speaking to them. They stand in places that influence crowds to move differently, away from certain streets, toward others, avoiding specific blocks altogether. This is battlefield conditioning. They're not responding to danger. They're anticipating it. And if they're anticipating it, you must assume they know something you don't. Their arrival marks a point of no return, not because they bring danger, but because their presence confirms that danger has already crossed into the city. They are not scouts. They are not observers. They are deployment units. When they take positions, it means the window for a clean civilian evacuation is closing. You don't wait to see what happens next. You don't hope for clarity. You don't assume they're there to protect you. Their mission is not your survival. Your survival depends on leaving before their movements become the new normal. When the trained arrive, the city is no longer yours. A city doesn't fall when buildings crumble or when streets burn. It falls when trust dissolves. Long before the collapse becomes visible, the human network that holds the city together begins to fracture. This is the seventh indicator, the collapse of trust networks. And it is the point where the city stops functioning as a community and becomes a collection of isolated individuals, each calculating their own chances of survival. When trust dies, everything else follows. You notice it first in the smallest interactions. The shop owner who used to greet you with familiarity now watches you with caution. The neighbor who once offered help becomes distant, guarded, evasive. The doctor who always had answers suddenly avoids specifics. These are not personality shifts. They are survival adjustments. People begin pulling back because they sense something deeper than inconvenience. They sense threat. Then the reliable disappear. The ones who understand the city's pulse better than anyone else. Long-time residents who've seen cycles rise and fall. Skilled workers who know the system's vulnerabilities. Individuals with quiet influence. Building managers, supply coordinators, district organizers. They leave without announcement, without fanfare, without explanation. They don't warn the city because warning a collapsing structure is pointless. They simply exit before the rest realize what's coming. You also watch for changes in cooperation. Community groups that once operated smoothly start fracturing. Leaders delay meetings. Volunteers don't show up. Information stops flowing between people who used to share it freely. The chain of communication thins. What was once mutual support becomes hesitant silence. People sense instability, and their first instinct is to protect themselves, not their neighbors. Then you track the shift in posture. Families barricading more than usual, locking doors earlier, reducing social interactions, avoiding gatherings, parents pulling children from activities, Workers calling in sick more frequently. These micro-withdrawals aren't about safety, they're about distrust. When people stop believing the environment is controllable, they retreat into isolation. But the strongest signal comes from the gatekeepers, the ones who maintain the flow of the city. The grocer who begins rationing quietly, the mechanic who takes fewer jobs, the landlord who suddenly stops renewing leases, the nurse who hints that something feels off. These people see the collapse before anyone else, because they feel it in the patterns of their work. When they shift behavior, it means the foundation is cracking. And finally comes the moment when people stop expecting help from institutions and start depending entirely on themselves. It's subtle but absolute. They stockpile quietly. They make private plans. They avoid asking questions they don't want the answers to. They stop trusting the system because they sense the system no longer trusts itself. This is the point of no return. Not the chaos, the retreat from connection. A city can survive shortages, conflict, even violence, but it cannot survive the collapse of trust. When the network that holds people together decays, the city is already dead. The body just hasn't fallen yet. You don't wait for the official announcement. You don't wait for the city to admit what it has already revealed. When trust networks fail, you act. Because once people turn inward, cooperation disappears, and without cooperation, evacuation becomes a race against millions of isolated survivors all trying to escape at once. You leave before that happens. Because once trust breaks, everything breaks. Evacuation is not an event. It's a protocol, executed with precision, silence, and zero hesitation. When even one indicator crosses your threshold, you prepare. When two align, you position. When three strike at once, you leave. Not tomorrow. Not when it's convenient. Not when the city finally admits it's dying. You move when the window is still invisible to everyone else. That's how you survive without becoming part of the stampede. Your first action is internal. You shift into extraction mode. Emotion off. Instinct on. You stop announcing your plans. Stop discussing concerns. Stop sharing observations. OPSEC becomes absolute. In a collapsing city, information is more dangerous than bullets. It attracts attention, competition, and desperate people. The moment you signal intent, you compromise yourself. So you stay still, stay silent, and watch. Next, you evaluate your exit routes. Not the ones on maps, the ones the city doesn't advertise. Service roads behind industrial zones. Secondary highways that bypass choke points. Residential corridors that connect through multiple districts. Bridges that offer movement when main arteries lock. You avoid rail stations, bus hubs, major intersections. Those become traps the moment panic spreads. Your route prioritizes anonymity over speed. Steady and visible movement beats fast, exposed movement every time. Then you prepare your carry load. Not a bag. A mobility package. Essentials only. Water, calories, warmth, medical, identification, protection, and redundancy for fire and light. Nothing that slows you, nothing that rattles, nothing that shines. You're not camping. You're exiting a hostile zone. Every ounce must earn its place. Your goal is 24 to 48 hours of autonomy, enough to break the gravitational pull of the city and reach safe terrain. You also secure your timing. Most people evacuate when the sun is up, when the streets are awake, when everyone is watching. You move during the transition periods, the hours when the city blinks, before dawn, just after midnight. When crowds thin and tension sleeps, you pass through districts before they realize they're unstable. You cross boundaries while others hesitate. Survival is timing, and you control the clock. You manage your presence with precision. No rushing. Rushing creates noise. No unnecessary stops. No conversations. No patterns. You walk like you belong everywhere but stay long nowhere. Confidence without aggression. Awareness without fear. The city is watching for weakness, not for purpose. Move like someone who is simply going home, and the city will ignore you long enough for you to leave it behind. Once you exit the urban perimeter, you don't relax. A collapsing city casts a long shadow. You maintain speed until you reach a zone with resources, visibility, and tactical advantage. Higher ground, lower density, clear fields of movement. You avoid small towns teetering on the edge of the same instability. The goal isn't distance. It's an environment that isn't feeding off the same dying system. And when you're finally clear, you don't look back. Cities don't collapse cleanly. They collapse in waves. Secondary failures, aftershocks, delayed violence, supply crashes, power vacuums. You leave before the first wave hits, and you stay away until every wave has passed. Evacuation is not escape. It's strategy, it's discipline. It's acknowledging that survival is not earned by strength, but by timing and invisibility. You don't wait to be rescued. You don't wait for clarity. You don't wait for confirmation. You leave because you saw what others refused to see. You survived because you acted when others stalled. Survival is not about defeating the collapse. It's about avoiding it entirely. You don't win by fighting the city as it falls. You win by never being caught beneath its weight. Every indicator, every signal, every shift you've learned is designed to give you one thing civilians never have during a crisis: time. Time to act. Time to move. Time to disappear before the world realizes what has already begun. Collapse is never sudden for those who know how to read it. It only feels sudden to the ones who weren't paying attention. You understand now that a failing city doesn't announce its death. It whispers it. Through silence in the infrastructure, through tension in the crowd, through shortages that look harmless until they aren't, through security patterns that thin at the edges, through information that fractures into noise, through the arrival of people who operate in shadows, through the quiet retreat of trust, the final breath before the fall. These aren't theories, they're realities. And once you learn to see them, you can never unsee them. You also understand that survival is not noise, it's precision, it's discipline. It's the refusal to wait for permission to protect yourself. Other people seek confirmation. You seek the exit. Other people look for reassurance. You look for the tactical truth. Other people freeze when the city trembles. You move before the city feels the tremor at all. That difference is life or death. In the end, every collapsing society produces two kinds of people: those who cling to the structure until it crushes them, and those who step away before the cracks become visible. You've chosen the second path, the path of anticipation, not reaction. You no longer rely on luck, authority, or the illusion of stability. You rely on observation, timing, and your ability to act without hesitation. A city in decline tries to drag everyone with it, but it only traps the ones who wait too long. You won't be among them. You've learned the language of collapse, the signals that reveal the truth, and the discipline required to move before the world falls apart. You've learned that survival isn't heroic, it's invisible, and invisibility is the strongest armor you possess. Remember this: the indicators don't lie. The people interpreting them do. When doubt whispers, you silence it. When hesitation tries to anchor you, you cut the anchor. When the signs align, you don't look back. You exit. You endure. You outlive the fall.